Eventually, I did not know how long it took me, I reawakened to my surroundings and to the news I had heard. Clara must have been wrong, yet I knew it had to be true. It was all over now. I never would see my beloved ones again, never hear my sister's laughter, never again have mother's care or listen to father's plans. They had simply vanished, and by some terrible mistake. It was I who should have died, I who was prepared 1,000 times to leave them behind. I had gone to sea to fight for their lives and safety, and I had failed them completely. Why had God taken their innocent lives instead of my guilty one? Clara, too, recovered slowly from the shock. She was gloomy and sad about her role as Death's messenger. I tried to calm her and told her that she had spared me much anguish and a trip in the wrong direction, and then I altered my plans. There was no need for travelling toward Darmstadt. In Eisenach, I changed trains together with Clara and headed south toward Lake Constance. The night was long and our conversation moved tediously. I could think of nothing but the loss of all I had loved and the pointlessness of all that remained. When the train rattled into another grey November morning, and when I wiped the foggy moisture from the window, it came as a crashing irony to read the slogan painted on a wall of a station house. Our cities crumble, our walls collapse, but our hearts never break. As the night fell on the eastern spur of the Black Forest, the train reached Clara's hometown. She said goodbye, bewildered and shy. I travelled into another night, and I did not stop until I saw the moon reflected in the waters of Lake Constance. I dragged my luggage from the car in Überlingen East, where my relatives had sought refuge from the war. As I started for their house, I had a sudden urge to turn and take another train and return to crew and boat. That was where I belonged. But I kept on going, the suitcase with the presents hanging heavy in my hand. I did not know what to do with the gifts. I did not even have a sweetheart to whom I could give them. Marianne had died in the early ruins of Berlin. Yvonne had disappeared years before. I had lost Marguerite and Paris to the Americans, and Marika was the wife of another man. My appearance at the door of grandfather's house caused consternation. My numerous relatives, living more or less in harmony under a large roof, had not expected my return from the depths of the Atlantic. They thought I had been lost in the turmoil of the invasion. That was about the time my parents had received my last letter. Their shock at my resurrection immediately gave way to disturbed looks and nervous whispers behind my back. To put their minds at rest, I said firmly, "I've heard. You don't have to explain." "What do you intend to do?" they asked with worried looks. "I don't know." "Do you wish to stay?" "No, I just came to say hello. I'll leave my books and some other things." Soon I learned that my cousin, Laura, had found refuge in the Black Forest, and I phoned her immediately. Laura told me that there was much snow there and that the skiing was good. At last I found an escape, a place to go to forget. Early next morning, relieved of books and presents, I departed from the lake. The slow-moving train carried me into the mountain ranges, which turned from dark green to brilliant white in an hour's time. Winter had come earlier than expected. At a station stop deep in the forest, I mounted a horse-drawn sled which brought me upland to Schönwald, where my cousin had reserved a room for me in a hotel. Laura was an excellent skier. In the next several days we met when the first sun rays touched the white tips of the evergreens, and we climbed into the woods, then slalomed down into the valleys. We repeated the exhausting tour many times each morning, ate lunch from a canvas bag I carried attached to my belt, then continued skiing over the white meadows and frozen streams until the sun set. My depression gradually relaxed its grip. Laura did all she could to cheer me up, but she could do only so much. She could not blot out the sound of artillery, and every evening we could hear the thunder of heavy guns rolling in from the Vosges only 60 kilometres to the west. We could not close our ears to the radio broadcasts, which told of staggering losses on all fronts. The Soviets had captured Riga, overrun Lithuania, bitten off half of Poland, and pocketed the Balkans. The fighting was fierce on the west bank of the Rhine, and American bombers had levelled Cologne and Aachen. I listened to these reports with increasing nervousness. No, I could not stay here in moody idleness while the Reich's defences crumbled and her cities vanished in fire and smoke. I belonged, once again, with my boat and my crew. They were all I had left. One cold November afternoon I said goodbye to Laura and took the sled bound for the train station. As we descended into the peaceful valley, I asked myself where in God's name we were going. What had happened to all the wonder weapons we had been promised over and over again? Without them, how could we possibly stop the Russians, the Americans, the British, the French, the whole world? I arrived at the U-boat base in Lübeck-Seems on a cold, blustery day. Selde, the young chief whom I had left in charge of the skeleton crew during my absence, reported that air raids and missing parts had slowed down work on our boat, that, far from making our deadline, we would be lucky if we left port by New Year's Day. Yet despite the bad news, I settled in my cosy room with a feeling that I had finally found refuge. The room smelled of cedar woods and resin. I knew my men in the adjoining rooms, heard their talk, recognized their voices and their laughter. I felt comfortably at ease. Their presence gave me confidence and purpose. I joined and talked with my comrades that night and soon learned that all too many of them had also tasted personal tragedy on their leaves. Berger had found his hometown of Cleve, a stone's throw behind the Western Front, in ashes. His wife and only child perished in the flames. Someone had led him to the grave and told him that they were buried there. That very hour he had turned around and set out for base and boat. A machinist's mate had found his parents' home in ruins, and his family gone without leaving an address. He, too, had hurried back to port. Others had spent their furlough on trains and buses, tracing their families' flights from town to town. For those who had finally made a reunion, there was little time left to spend together. Some of my men had returned without even reaching their destination. The front had already rolled past their towns and homes in Silesia. For all of them, as for me, the road led only one way, back to boat and comrades, back to the men with whom they had shared their gravest hours. Not all my dealings with my company were pleasant and comradely. December had arrived with snow and cold, with biting winds from the east that announced a long winter, and my continuing problems with 3 officers made my mood as grim as these grey days. My exec, my chief, and the ensign were immature and inexperienced. They not only gave me more trouble than help, they also disaffected the crew. The men, decorated professionals with long and distinguished combat records, had little use for the unskilled chief, and they viewed the very young ensign with distinct disdain. These problems were too difficult and dangerous to cope with on a frontline U-boat, so I had regretfully called the personnel department to ask for replacements for the chief and the ensign. This routine request, which a year before would have been honoured automatically, even if the captain's reasons were capricious, was summarily rejected. I protested that I was trying to save the life of boat and crew. The reaction, a shrug that seemed to say, "What difference did it make?" The life expectancy of a U-boat was too short to worry about, even if she had a perfect crew. My troubles with the ensign merely began with his general incompetence. To make matters worse, he had been assigned by the party to indoctrinate my crew with official theories, ideals, and never-say-die slogans. Such party meddling in U-boat affairs had a brief but stormy history, dating back to the attempt to assassinate Hitler. Before then, the U-boat force had been free of political interference. Even afterward, when the power of the party had increased everywhere else, the U-boat captains, myself among them, had successfully countered the infiltration of politically trained officers by passive resistance. But with the Reich's accelerating decline, the party grew ever more powerful and dogmatic, to the increasing dismay of our U-boat veterans, officers, and men alike. My comrades had complained to me from time to time of the ensign's blatant approaches. Their reaction was perfectly normal. They had proved their loyalty and courage with deeds, and they needed no party preacher to tell them how to fight and die. Whether or not I could get the ensign transferred out, I was determined to stop his harassing sermons. I called for a conference and made it clear to all three, the chief, the exec, and the ensign, that they had not yet qualified for their positions aboard U-953, and that they might not have the jobs long if they did not follow my strict training program to make themselves fit for patrol. In addition, I gave the ensign so many minor duties that he had no time for party speeches. By the second week of December, activity in port had increased dramatically, pointing to a spring offensive for our forces at sea. Within a 10-day period, 5 conventional U-boats arrived from the Baltic. The barracks spilled over with new life. The shipyard resounded with hammering and riveting. But the boats in port bespoke no drastic change. They had everything in common with our ancient U-953, and all the renewed activity promised no halt to our precipitous decline. But suddenly a brilliant thrust lighted the dark horizons in the west and stirred new hope in Germany. In the early morning hours of December 16th, our armies in the Ardennes had launched a massive counter-offensive against the Anglo-American forces. The nation's radio networks proclaimed smashing victories and major advances in the first hours of our assault. The great offensive, long promised, had finally materialized. We were moving westward again, and our divisions would not halt until the last Allied soldier was driven into the sea. I listened to the news and to the fanfares with a mixture of hope, anxiety, and caution. Though the assault had produced spectacular early results, it had been confined to a front too narrow for deep penetration. My hopes faded, and my anxiety grew as the days passed and the good news dwindled. 1 week after we had been agitated by fanfares and military marches, the voices which had told us of a quick victory went silent. The offensive had been slowed down by ice and snow and mud, and it was stopped by the fresh Allied divisions that rushed in to reinforce the bulge in their lines. By Christmas Eve, our chances for a major victory had vanished. Christmas Eve in port was solemn and calm, at least until midnight. I made my evening rounds through the various rooms, talking quietly with my men, offering them reassurance they did not need. Each man had grown his own hard shell to protect his spirit from the torments of our dissolving world. I retreated into my quarters after sharing too many drinks with my officers, mates, and enlisted men. I brewed coffee on my hot plate, sank into the armchair, and read for a while. The room was filled with the sweet aroma of the evergreen that my men had erected in a corner. It brought to mind memories of happier Christmases. The compound grew silent. I went to sleep, little dreaming that the high jinks had already begun. Hours after midnight, I was roused by loud knocking on my door. It was the political ensign who was on watch duty. "Sir, I beg to report that there are girls in the men's quarters." I laughed. "Do you suffer from hallucinations?" "No, sir, I saw one of the seamen sneak through the fence with a female and disappear into a room." The matter became interesting. I began a cautious inspection tour at the far end of the barracks, where many of the men shared a single room. I opened the door quietly. All was dark and peaceful. I switched on the light, but discovered that the boys had taken the precaution of removing the bulbs. "Get your flashlight, ensign." "Jawohl, Herr Oberleutnant," he said, full of excitement and enterprise. I remained at the door, listening. The slow, rhythmical breathing of sleeping men was all I heard. I regretted the ensign's meddling in this matter, and my own. At this point in the war, what difference did it make where the boys made love? Surely none of us had long to live and love. Still, orders were made to be enforced. The ensign returned with the flashlight, and I played its beam over the first man's face and blanket. All seemed natural. The next face woke up and big eyes blinked in the cold light. The third blanket was suspiciously bulky, and I lifted one corner of it. The small face of a frightened blonde girl appeared. I realized how rude I was, and guiltily dropped the blanket. Then the barracks lights came on, and I discovered 2 other girls hiding in beds. I halted my investigation then and there, trusting that the men in the other room had heard the commotion and would get their sweethearts out of the barracks in a hurry. As for the 3 men already exposed, I could not avoid the old conflict between military discipline and personal loyalty. However, I postponed a decision until after the holidays. On the 2nd day of Christmas, the earth began to tremble, and there was a steady rumbling in the distance. I knew the sound well. It meant that a city was being bombed into dust. In this case, Hamburg. I took my powerful binoculars and posted myself on the nearby highway, which commanded an excellent view of the countryside. The sky was pale blue and cloudless, the air cold and clear. A white winter sun shone over Hamburg, and from where I stood I could see the glint of the sun on the wings and fuselages of flying fortresses coming in from the sea. They glided out of the sky and moved relentlessly forward. Flight after flight pushed through the haze in the distance and droned over the dying city. Tiny grey and black flak clouds popped up among the hundreds of bombers and their countless fighter escorts. Through my glasses I saw the bombs raining down upon Hamburg, aircraft exploding, red and yellow fireballs erupting in the silken sky, burning planes tumbling through the air, our Messerschmitt fighters plunging upon the bombers like hawks, filling the sky with debris. The ground shook under my feet, many kilometres away from the target. Thousands of innocents who had prayed on Christmas Eve were being roasted alive and turned into ashes. And I thought that my loved ones must have died the same way. What a miserable, obscene war, where able-bodied men and sophisticated machines were employed to exterminate the helpless and harmless. I told myself that my war was quite a different kind of struggle, that it was a war in which ships were engaged to sink ships, weapons and supplies before they could be used to destroy. But whichever way one fought the war, the total results were indivisible and hideous beyond the powers of men to comprehend. Death on a gigantic scale had become so routine that life itself seemed rather odd and irrelevant, and all the once commonplace joys of life seemed abnormal, ludicrous, and weird. Even the love of a generous woman came as an unreal interruption in the normal nightmare of survival. My bitterness toward the war, my revulsion over the blunders and incompetence that made our sacrifices meaningless, became intolerable in early January. After spending the days between Christmas and New Year's trying to speed up work on our boat, I was summoned, without explanation, to meet with Admiral Dönitz at his headquarters outside Berlin. It was a puzzling command in that the Lion had steadily drifted further and further away from his captains. In the years of glorious victories he had visited them and their crews regularly in port. Later he had stopped making visits, and instead required his commanders to call on him in the cool atmosphere of his headquarters in Paris. Then, after the Allies had captured Paris and sunk most of our U-boats, meetings with the Lion had ceased almost entirely. In Berlin, I took a room in the Hotel Fürstenhof, showered and shaved, put on a fresh white shirt and a new tie, rode the S-Bahn to the eastern suburb of Bernau, boarded a small bus that had been waiting for me, then rolled over a deserted highway through the pine woods to the closely guarded headquarters complex, known by the exotic name Korala. After a sentry had scrutinized my papers, I was ushered into the inner sanctum of the mighty naval establishment. Its maze of sterile hallways and its legions of immaculate white-jacketed officers created the impression of a huge hospital. Only the smell of ether and antiseptic was missing. At once I felt out of place and wished to return to my sweaty, grimy men. I was told that the Admiral had not yet arrived and was invited to join the staff at lunch. The decorated tables, the fine linen, the exquisite china, the ornate silverware, the serried ranks of distinguished officers in tailored white jackets, all this seemed to me excessively grand and self-indulgent. I found myself thinking that most of these men should have spent the war years to better advantage. If they had enjoyed themselves a little less and worked a little harder to supply us with the means to fight, Germany would still have many of the crews that went down in the 203 U-boats sunk in the previous year. We might even have a fleet as large as our Ghost Armada. the 682 U-boats which had been sunk since the start of the war. As the elegant diners departed, I was left with 5 officers whose blues set them apart from the white-jacketed permanent staff, and whose lack of U-boat decorations marked them as new men who had never tasted battle. We struck up a conversation, and I learned that they were captains of new boats of a series that was already obsolete when commissioned, and that they had been ready to set out on their first patrol when the Admiral summoned them. I looked at them, and I saw dead men. They stood little chance of surviving without experience, even if they were intelligent, capable, well-trained officers. If they had heard of the enemy's vast and sophisticated defence system, they did not know how to cope with it. And, I suspected, they had not been advised of what they would soon face. After some time, we 6 were told that the Lion was ready to see us, and we were guided into a large, bright room. Dönitz stood at the window, the wintry sunlight touching his pale face. He had aged considerably since I saw him last in Lorient in 1941, on that hot autumn day when he fastened the Iron Cross on my chest. Now he looked thinner, smaller, less dynamic. The Admiral pressed our hands and gestured toward a row of chairs facing his desk. He walked up and down before us and then began to speak. He talked slowly and quietly, a sharp contrast to his energetic, fiery manner of earlier years. But he seemed confident and determined. He spoke of the need for our continued sacrifices and of the great improvements in U-boat warfare that would come very soon. He told us that the purpose of our latest mission was to tie down Allied naval units in their own waters and prevent them from reaching toward territories still controlled by our forces. We were the gallant ones who would keep up the good fight until our revolutionary new U-boats would turn the tide of the war, and we would have one of those new boats when we returned from this patrol. Finally, Dönitz made the shocking announcement that, to achieve our present objective, he would send every available conventional U-boat to the front, even those which had been relegated to training use. The Admiral's talk was brief and altogether impressive. Dönitz, though he seemed worn and weary, still transmitted that same spark of enthusiasm which had galvanized us when he spoke in our years of triumph. Yet nothing he said was really new, and I had the feeling that he was convincing only because I wanted so desperately to believe him. From what I knew of Dönitz, his tactics which once had led us to victory were now causing the senseless death of thousands of trusting men in outdated divine machines. His latest order I could only interpret as a frantic attempt to delay inevitable defeat. Yet I wished with all my heart that I was wrong. After a 2-day absence, I returned to the base. At breakfast the next morning, the exec reported that the overhaul of U-953 had indeed been completed, and that our boat had been towed to the pier the previous day. Then, brimming over with excitement, he told me that 2 of the newest type U-boats had come alongside ours just before dusk. I cut short my breakfast, changed into my leather suit, and went down to the riverfront. U-953, freshly painted, deck scraped, guns greased, lay at the foot of the pier. My men assembled on the aft deck for the roll call, glancing at me with one eye and with the other at the monstrous new boats to either side. I stepped aboard our revived workhorse, returned the exec's salute and the crew's friendly "Good morning, sir," then told the old seafarers that we would have to sail once more in our old boat before we would get a new one of the sort they saw swaying nearby. I made that promise in the hope that Dönitz would be able to keep his pledge to me. From what I could learn in my dockside inspection of U-953, the shipyard had done an excellent job. Our boat, which had suffered from all the ills of old age, displayed a rejuvenated fitness and all new equipment. A hydraulic schnorkel with a much improved float had replaced the primitive one that had caused so much hardship and a near disaster. The stink of decay had been routed by the clean smell of fresh paint. U-953 seemed to be ready. I then went to inspect one of the newest type submersibles. Crossing the gangplank to one of the big whales, I asked the seaman on guard, "Is the captain aboard?" "Yes, sir, he is." "What's his name?" "Kapitän Leutnant Siegmann, my old captain of U-230. I climbed up the huge superstructure to the bridge, dropped through the hatch into a highly sophisticated conning tower, then lowered myself into the control room, which looked like a power station. I saw Siegmann in his nook with his back turned toward me, and I said, "Good morning, I wish to report aboard." He spun around. "What the devil, it is you! What brings you into this lousy port?" "I have come from Norway with an old jalopy to have a new one made out of it." "You're still sailing one of those old coffins?" he asked with surprise. "Yes, I don't have your connections. Congratulations on your new boat." "Thanks. Come on, I'll show you around. Or have you seen such a ship before?" "No, I have never had the pleasure." As we walked to the bow, he told me that he had exchanged U-230 for this boat in the spring of the previous year, that the U-230 under the command of Oberleutnant Eberbach had been scuttled by her crew on August 21st when the Allies landed at Toulon, that most of our old comrades had been captured and imprisoned, that Friedrich, who had also left the boat in the spring, was still his chief, and that Riedel had become captain of U-242. We arrived in the bow torpedo room. 6 tubes, instead of the conventional 4, extended into the large compartment. Special storage magazines for 14 spare torpedoes were located alongside the hull. "We charge all tubes hydraulically within 10 minutes, Siegmann explained. "We push a few buttons, and all goes very quietly. We don't touch the torpedoes anymore." The compartment was equipped solely for storing, servicing, and reloading the torpedoes, and crew, which on old boats slept crowded together among the steel fish, lived in a roomy compartment of their own. Officers' and petty officers' quarters were like first-class staterooms on a passenger liner. The boat's displacement was nearly 3 times that of V953. Siegmann continued, "You will be astounded to hear that we are faster below surface than above, and can maintain a top submerged speed of 17 knots for quite some time. Then you can revive the convoy battles from a submerged position. More than that, we are not only faster, we have more torpedoes and can shoot them at a depth of 50 meters without seeing the targets. We dive almost twice as deep as you with your old tube, and we run away from every pursuing escort with ease. That makes you practically invulnerable." "You're right. The high speed allows us to attack and escape below surface without detection. A new computer guidance system gives us a 100% accuracy of fire. Our new schnorkel is managed pretty much the same way you handle your scope. It goes up as quickly and permits faster recharging of the batteries. This boat is the total submarine." What we had been told for many months was true. The new boats indeed existed, and the evidence was overwhelming that they were truly wonder U-boats. Sent out in sufficient numbers, they could force the Allies onto the defensive at sea. If only the fronts in east and west could hold out long enough. Siegmann declined my invitation for lunch. He was spending the weekend with his family. We separated warmly, wishing each other luck and success. But we both knew that a barrier had come between us. His magnificent new boat gave him a reasonable guarantee of living to see the end of the war. My antique boat, however, condemned me to almost certain death in the British shooting gallery. With growing bitterness in my heart and great concern for my crew, I prepared myself for an early sailing. On the morning of February 8th, U-953 slipped out of Lübeck harbour and headed north. After 12 hours of rocking in the waves, it was as if we had never been on land, and our boat, despite all the unkind remarks we had made about her, seemed fit and well behaved. U-953 sliced at high speed through the narrow, shallow waters between the Danish islands. A whole arsenal of new electronic equipment protected her from sneak attacks. A sensitive new radar, small and handy, turned steadily to scan the sky and the waterway. We reached the open Skagerrak on the eve of the second day of our mission. Our arrival in deep water coincided with the appearance of fog and with increased enemy air activity. Feeble radar impulses flashed from various sources, but the dense fog shielded our boat as cotton protects a fragile glass jar in a box. Despite the white blanket, I did not intend to risk remaining on surface just for the sake of making headway. As our radar picked up the images of two aircraft, I ordered, "Dive, Chief! Dive cautiously!" I heard the long sigh of blowing air and felt the boat falling away. My last thought before I closed the lid was that the British would have a hard time finding the spot of our submergence in the fog. U-953 dived for a submerged run, which I had intended to last until we completed our patrol, 7 or 8 weeks hence. As the hiss of escaping air ceased, there was a cry. "Diesel loading hatch cracked. Boat takes heavy water." "Not again," I groaned. "The hell with this old ship." Then I yelled, "Close vents, stand by to surface. Level off, Chief." All of a sudden the boat tilted sharply astern. Concluding that the leak was serious, I ordered both bilge pumps started up. But before the pumps became effective, U-953 fell away quickly. I gave my instructions as routinely as possible. "Blow all tanks, both full ahead. Surface. Don life preservers." At the chief's cry, "Bridge is clear," I rushed to the platform, followed by the gunners. Dusk had replaced daylight. The fog was so thick around the boat that she seemed to have lost her bow and stern. We had but one way to go, north into Oslofjord. There I expected to find facilities to repair the leak at Horten, a small naval base, if we survived the night. "Aircraft, bearing 125, distance 500, approaching," came a cry through the voice tube. Then a scream in the air. The starboard 20mm two-barreled gun started to blaze. The 37mm automatic followed suit. In a split second, a faint shadow passed over the boat and disappeared before my men could swing their guns. Somewhere 2 bombs detonated almost simultaneously. The engines of a second attacker roared closer fast. Our guns sent up a barrier of metal into the fog. Then the plane was above, bellowing, spitting. Bright light showered from the sky. The fog glared like a sheet of fire. The Tommy had dropped a parachute flare that hung somewhere in the fog. A new attack came from starboard aft. A wall of tracers spread through the glare. A second flare unfolded. While the 2 planes circled, our radar picked up a third image. Soon 4 aircraft circled around us like hungry vultures. We awaited the next assault with a new supply of ammunition and a wary glance at the ice-cold water of the Skagerrak. Then, one by one, the planes dived down on us. But their strafing missed, and our gunfire held them outside of bombing range. As the attack concluded, our radar picked up the images of only 3 planes. Our diesels hammered in concert with the engines in the air. Our guns moved in circles, following the radar's directions. For over 2 hours there was no new attack. Then at 02:20, our radar went dead. With the blinding of our eye in the sky, we had no defence, no accurate fire. The end of our boat seemed nearer than Oslofjord. We spent another 2 hours under closest surveillance by the British. Then the improbable, the incomprehensible occurred. One by one the planes gave up pursuit. At 04:40 the air was free of aircraft. Shortly after 0600 the fog rose and disclosed the Norwegian mountains. An hour later we sailed into Horten harbour. To my great disappointment, I found that the small base was not equipped to repair the diesel hatch, and I was told to try in Kristiansand, where the flotilla had a sizable floating machine shop. However, I managed to find a clever electrician who replaced the scorched radar cable. After a restless day in port, I sailed U-953 into another frustrating night. Creeping along the rocky coastline, feeling our way ahead with radar between cliffs and through a small fishing fleet, we again escaped detection by the British, who were busy scrutinising the southern horizon. 1 hour before daybreak, we snaked into Kristiansand harbour. But here I learned that the only place we could have the leak plugged was Bergen. I had no choice but to continue on surface, trusting in my luck and the heedlessness of the British flyers. There was absolutely nothing I could do to avoid disaster if the enemy struck in a mass assault. We sailed out of Kristiansand 1 hour after dusk, hammered through a moderate sea, surged by menacing rocks, dashed into and through the fjords in the shadows of the mountains. We wound around cliffs and ambushes at night and hid our boat under flimsy screens in ports during the day. When I finally turned the bow of our boat into Bergenfjord at sunrise on February 16th, we had completed a trip that had been considered virtually impossible. We had travelled all the way from Lübeck to Bergen on surface without receiving a single scratch. I was convinced I could not do it again. We found the 11th U-boat flotilla in a state of terrible anxiety. The tension was caused in part by the disappearance of U-1053 the previous day. Ready for war patrol, the boat had failed to surface after her last deep-dive manoeuvre, and despite a frenzied night-long search, no trace of her had been found. Then, too, the radio had announced the distressing news that the Red Army had broken through our eastern front and had driven our troops to the west bank of the Oder River. Incredible as it seemed, the Russians had succeeded in establishing a bridgehead near Wriezen, only 60 kilometres east of Berlin, and just 40 kilometres from Dönitz's headquarters. Clearly, truth was stronger than hope and desire. It was brutally impartial. I realised that Germany's very existence was in deeper jeopardy than we had the courage to admit. Nonetheless, I continued my work as if the war would go on forever. With grim energy, I concentrated on running my boat as I had pledged, and on sailing her as I had been ordered. In the afternoon of that vexatious day, I steered U-953 into the shipyard to have the loading hatch riveted and welded shut. I had all equipment stowed aboard and did not intend to use that hatch again as long as I remained at the helm of U-953. I retired early, for it was my last chance to sleep in linen and in peace before weeks of submergence. At noon the next day, I sailed U-953 out of the shipyard, assured that the seam of the hatch would now withstand the severest depth charge attack. In order to test the boat's tightness, I followed the path U-1053 had taken to her death. The same small trawler which had attended her descent awaited the start of our deep-dive manoeuvre. I brought U-953 into position, locked myself and the crew into the hull, then ordered the chief to lower the boat below surface, slowly, cautiously. We listened for a bolt to blow, a seam to crack. All remained calm. U-953 reached the limit of her test, stayed tight, behaved well, and obeyed all orders willingly. It was late in the evening of February 17th when we finally left Bergen. The night had fallen quickly over the fjord, and the mountains closed in as if to swallow us. The wind chased heavy clouds from west to east, occasionally covering the moon and providing a curtain to help us escape detection. After 2 hours, we reached the northern exit of Bergenfjord, where bizarre cliffs, reflecting in the pale moonlight, broke the foamy onslaught of the ocean. "Radar impulses all over forward quarters," shouted the mate through the voice tube. I knew we could not stay on surface for long, but I needed more time to clear the boat from currents and cliffs. As she crossed from the silvery surface of the fjord into the rough waters of the Norwegian Sea, I called the chief to the hatch. "Listen carefully, Selde," I said as if to a child. "When I call for alarm, I want you to bring the boat very cautiously below. No rush, no excessive down-tilt. No more than 30 metres, you understand?" "Yes, sir. No more than 30 metres." "Target 2500, bearing 0, cried the mate. That was the end of our surface run. The bell shrieked. Air escaped the tanks piercingly. Before I lowered myself into the hatch, I noticed that the bow fell away somewhat too fast and hollered, "Hold the boat above 30 metres, Chief. Watch out." As I slammed the lid shut, I felt the boat sink at an increasing down angle. "Verdammt, catch the boat and hold her nose up." The bow dipped toward rocks which could slice her hull wide open. Within seconds, a violent jolt threw me from the tower onto the deck plates. Then the boat leaped like a wild horse and shot toward the surface. I seized the controls, a few hard rudder manoeuvres, fast trimming and adjusting, and the boat calmed down. Shaken and outraged, I called the chief to attention. "What in the devil's name were you doing?" "The trim must have been disturbed, sir. Selde mumbled apologetically. Nonsense! You established trim just a few hours ago. It could have been also the frontal impact of the sea. Come on, Selde, no more of that. I guess I'll have to teach you diving again when we return into port, if we ever return. I grabbed the microphone from its overhead cradle. Attention bow torpedo room. Check all tube doors and linkage. Check outboard valves. Report at once. After minutes of strained waiting, the calls came in. The exec in the bow room reported everything in order. Although the shock had been extraordinary, we had escaped damages. For a while, U-953 floated peacefully at the designated depth, course northwest, direction Atlantic. But soon the chief again demonstrated his inexperience, and worse, his lack of aptitude. Incapable of holding the boat level on schnorkel depth, he repeatedly exposed her to the watchful Tommies and allowed her to tumble down toward the floor. Each time the chief disturbed the buoyancy, it sent the whole company through new tortures. The vacuum it created set the men twisting and vomiting in agony while they were tossed about wildly by the boat's pirouettes. Each time the punishment became unbearable, I again assumed control and again tried to teach my chief the fundamentals of schnorkeling. We continued our tumultuous progress, though the mission seemed futile. By the time of our sailing, the Allies had called in vast dispersed naval forces and concentrated them in the waters around the British Isles. Destroyers in overwhelming numbers were posted near the Shetland and Faroe Islands to catch our few lone wolves, whose comings and goings had been reported beforehand to the British Admiralty by Allied sympathisers or agents. None of our preparations for a spring offensive had remained a secret. During the first days of February, 6 U-boats had been sunk, all on their first patrol. One by one they sailed into the enemy's bristling defence. They were too slow to evade his skilled air and sea teamwork, and most of their officers were too inexperienced to know the tricks of survival. The seas around England had become a sort of private pool in which the British eagerly played their game of killing off a helpless U-boat now and then. And if the hundreds of aircraft and surface vessels failed to sink our boats, then the hundreds of square miles of minefields did. Such were the conditions when U-953 approached the first line of Allied defence. For days the crew had suffered the painful manoeuvres of our incompetent chief. Yet despite their shattered eardrums and their blurred vision, they lost none of their spirit or humour. When calm sailing replaced the cruel schnorkeling routine, the crew immediately relaxed and engaged in optimistic pursuits. Some wrote letters they knew might never be mailed or never reach their destination. Others read and wrote poetry. I occasionally received copies of their literary endeavours along with the typewritten sheets of daily armed forces communiques. The poems made up in authenticity for what they lacked in grace. The Schnorkel Lament, written by machinist Hagemann, joked about the terrible suffering we endured every night. But we were born to schnorkel till very late, and we were chosen to suffer this nightly fate, and we will depend for the rest of our lives on the eardrums and eyeballs of our faithful wives. Mechanic Mueller, a good-natured fellow, chose to versify on a more cheerful theme. After 1 week spent cautiously circumventing hordes of hunters, we received our order of operation. It came 1 hour after midnight on February 23rd, while U-953 was rocking severely in a storm which came rolling in from the west. The inept chief tried frantically to hold the boat on schnorkel depth, but she rose and fell like a seesaw, forcing the men to cling to pipes and wheels as they tried to perform their duties. In despair, I took over again and said, "How often, Chief, must I show you how to control the boat and lay her on even keel?" He replied, "The storm is getting worse, that's why I can't hold her." "Don't tell me that story again, Selde. You see her steady now. Just hold her at 13 metres. Within a few minutes the boat again lost her stability. The men gasped for air and slid around on the wet deck plates as if on ice. They rolled their eyes in despair, silently begging me to put an end to the senseless torture. Then the boat tilted up sharply and shot to the surface, exposing her superstructure and offering a splendid target. The hawks had detected us already. "Radar impulses, volume 3, yelled the operator. Resisting the urge to open the hatch and send the gunners to the bridge, I shouted, "Both diesels emergency ahead. Open all vents. All men to the bow, you included, Chief." The diesels knocked wildly. The boat rocked hard. For a few seconds that lasted a lifetime, the sea held the boat in a crazy position. Then she sank, slowly, steadily. As she swung into a 40-degree down angle, the surprised men struggled to their stations, crawling, pushing, pulling themselves toward the stern sections. The electric motors took over from the diesels. Schnorkel and scope cut under, and the boat plunged into the depths. At 80 meters, I managed to level her off and establish her trim. Only then did we realize that no bombs had followed us. 20 minutes later, as U-953 schnorkeled her way smoothly westward, I closed the book on the Chief once and for all. Clearly, Selde would never learn. Clearly, too, I could not justify giving him another chance to kill 54 men. I requested him to stay out of the control room and spend the rest of the patrol in the wardroom as my guest. I remained at the control for the rest of the night. When the first astic impulses bounced against the hull and a number of propellers throbbed above in typical Search pattern, I had the engines stopped, the air mast lowered, and the boat prepared for an encounter. Headquarters' signal had been lying untouched on the plotting table since shortly after midnight. I held the paper to the small lamp and read, U-953. Operate in Plymouth Bay from Lizard Head to start point. Travel along 200-meter line. Information renew minefields follow. The order was astonishing for two reasons. Headquarters had terminated U-boat activity in the English Channel in October of the previous year, because our losses there outweighed our successes. Why did headquarters now decide to send us back to an area which had proved to be a U-boat wrecking yard? And why this insistent demand that our boats travel along the 200-meter line? Headquarters had been informed often enough about the strong enemy defences along that line. There, too, our losses provided grim confirmation. Determined not to commit suicide, I disregarded the latter part of the order and continued on my established route. U-953 advanced well on her march through the depths. I navigated her along the western edge of the huge minefields south of the Hebrides, avoided the herd of destroyers near the North Channel, then sliced through the calm coastal waters of Western Ireland, passing the familiar beacons. During this leg of our clandestine journey, headquarters' attempt to revive the U-boat war in the English Channel produced more casualties. U-480 was sunk near Land's End, and U-927 was bombed by aircraft at the Eddystone Rocks. U-927 was the 13th boat to go down to the bottom in February. For 17 days of submergence, I alternated at the controls with Berger, my top machinist, in a rigorous routine. U-953 left the southernmost tip of Ireland near Fastnet Rock Lighthouse to cross over into the English Channel. During these days we studied the armed forces communiques, desperately seeking the faintest glimmer of hope, all in vain. The news grew ever more hectic and crushing as our fronts collapsed completely under the Allied onslaught. On March 5th, American troops marched into Cologne. 2 days later they crossed the Rhine at Remagen, and soon the entire length of the Rhine from Holland to Koblenz had fallen into Allied hands. In the east, Soviet armies had stormed into Germany all along the front from the Baltic to Silesia, driving before them hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians. As we waited for a miracle to save our homeland, the hometown of many a crewman was overrun by the enemy. And all the while, our spring offensive at sea died of inadequate boats, and inexperienced young officers and helpless crews were bombed and depth-charged to the bottom in a steady procession, like ignorant animals filing to the butcher's block, and the music for their funerals was played by thousands of sound buoys shrieking false warnings of enemy destroyers poised for the kill. This diabolic concert accompanied us day after day, and the explosions which had sunk U-683 were still echoing through the depths when we cautiously approached Lizard Head, the southwestern spur of England, on a clear, sunny morning. The screams of the sound buoys followed us to the edge of Falmouth Harbour, where I spotted 3 real destroyers on a routine check. The vessels zigzagged throughout the forenoon, but the water's density protected us like a shield, and the strong current, which tossed us further into the bay, helped to conceal our presence. For several days we cruised in the coastal currents in search of worthy targets, sometimes having no more than 5 metres of water above the rim of the bridge and 2 metres below the keel. We floated secretly up and down, waiting for our chance, wedged between Eddystone Rocks and Plymouth Harbour, haunted by surface vessels and screening aircraft and screaming buoys, which kept us from reaching for air and charging our batteries. On March 19th, we came very close to sharing the fate of our friends. U-953 was lying aground, waiting for the tide to break, when faint propeller noises swelled into loud rotations with inexplicable speed. Before we had time to lift the boat off the ground, 3 destroyers had caught us in only 38 metres of water, and a series of depth charges made the boat take 6 quick convulsive jumps. However, the thunder of the barrage was not nearly as frightening as the noises that preceded and followed the attack. At first it sounded as if something like a chain or an iron net were being dragged along the hull. Then came a wild clattering, as if a great load of pebbles were being dumped upon the boat. These were brand new sounds to all of us, and a terrifying, tortuous experience. What was all this scraping and clattering? It could have been just another sound effect designed to torment us beyond the limit of our endurance. But I concluded, correctly as I later learned, that the British were using a new search device akin to the ASDIC. The reverberations of the first barrage had not yet died out when the destroyers launched a second attack. The ocean burst under new eruptions, shaking the ground, beating the boat, rupturing our eardrums, bending the steel to its limits. But U-953 still held tight. ASDIC impulses kept hitting the hull in relentless repetition, but the third series of canisters exploded further away. It now seemed that the destroyers had come upon us by accident, and that their various search devices failed to record a clear image of our hull. Soon the tide swept the hunters out to sea, and for over 3 hours we heard them continuing their random attempts to kill. March 20th. U-953 cruised with the strong current on periscope depth. At 09:20 I identified several mastheads at the easterly horizon. There was no sound detection. 10 minutes later the tips had grown, and the smokestacks of 7 cargo ships and 4 destroyers became clearly visible above the silvery surface. I was intoxicated by the view, gleeful at the thought of sending some of the black monsters to the bottom. I ordered speedily, "On battle stations, both half ahead." Weeks and months of waiting and taking punishment would now be rewarded. I set the boat on a collision course with the small convoy and calculated my chances. 2 escorts swept ahead of the bulky ships and 2 secured their wake. Their starboard side was open for attack. Berger, who was at the controls, handled the boat like an old professional. I was pleased with my choice of a new chief. While U-953 lay solidly in ambush, the small convoy made no evasive move. It ploughed toward Lizard Head or Falmouth Harbour with unbelievable frivolity. I was exultant over these easy kills and commanded, "Starboard 10, right so, hold her steady." I took a quick sweep of the horizon. A few tiny aircraft dotted the sky. Henniker plotted the course, and the first seaman's mate adjusted the dials of the computer. "Open tube doors, ready for firing, new distance 2000, both full ahead." U-953 raced at high speed, well concealed against the targets, momentarily ready to shoot and destroy. Then came a report that wrecked the attack. "Tube doors don't fully open." A string of oaths escaped my teeth. "Try again. You must open the doors." Seconds passed and the boat surged forward. "Can't get the doors open all the way. Linkage is bent," shouted the exec through the voice tube. "For the last time, you must get them open," I hollered. "They don't move at all," cried the exec, climbing into the tower in consternation. "Didn't you check them after we hit the rocks?" "Yes, sir, I did. They functioned then." Enraged and frustrated, now knowing that he had not checked the doors according to prescribed procedures, I put the boat aground. Then I rushed into the bow compartment, hoping to solve the problem. Several hands were still trying to turn the linkage, but the doors and bow caps remained locked in half-open position. The breakdown deprived us not only of our victories, but also of all chances of continuing the patrol. In fact, the situation was worse than anything we had previously experienced. With the outer torpedo doors frozen ajar, the inner doors were our only protection against the sea, and they were too frail to withstand the shock of a depth-charge explosion. I recalled the air raid in Brest, when a single bomb, exploding 50 metres from our boat, had broken off an interior door, even though the outer door was closed perfectly. I felt an icy chill run down my back. An encounter such as the one we had had the previous day would easily knock in our interior doors and drown all of us within seconds. Blaming myself for having taken my exec's early finding at face value and not having checked the tube door's mechanism myself when we were still near a shipyard, I now faced the dim prospect of making the long haul back to Norway. With but one tube in firing order, I grimly prepared for our silent run to home base through the deadly waters between England and Ireland. After the tide had broken, I lifted the boat from the bottom and steered her westward. Death stood up before our eyes when a raging depth-charge barrage, the one that destroyed U-327, thundered on our starboard side near Lizard Head. That day was doomsday for two other boats. Sekun 1003 was sunk in the North Channel, and U-905 was destroyed near the Hebrides. The battle continued to be a one-sided affair. Our boats were sunk methodically at the rate of one a day. The thunderous receptions our newcomers received in the North Channel and in traps near Land's End, and Lizard Head seemed to me a clear indication that the British had been informed of our assignments. It was during those weeks of our frenzied self-destruction that I lost one of my last old friends and classmates. Riedel, in command of U-242 and on his first mission as a captain, was lost somewhere around England. He sank quietly. No one knew exactly where his coffin went down. We cleared the North Channel, manoeuvred around the Hebrides, and schnorkeled cautiously in the Satin Sea. We circumvented countless destroyers along the way, and more near the Shetland Islands, and escaped a last British threat in the Norwegian Sea. As U-953 approached the majestic mountains, the Allies gave up their hunt in the anticipation that we would return. I entered Bergenfjord submerged, without signalling for an escort, then surfaced in utter despair and frustration. We had nothing to show for our long and agonizing voyage, nothing at all except our lives. Grey clouds hung low in the sky when U-953, once again old and rust-bitten, fastened her lines at the quay. It was 16:10 on April 7th, 1945. No one expected us. No one was there to greet us. It began to drizzle as the crew entered the compound. Bergen and the hills disappeared in the chilly squall. It was a sad sundown, full of misgivings. The Commandant 11th U-boat flotilla speedily arranged a dinner reception. I reported our mission uncompleted and said that we were lucky to get back alive. I told him of the convoy that had passed safely in front of our blocked torpedo tubes. "There is always a next time," said the commanding officer confidently. "The British don't simply vanish. You will have plenty of targets to shoot at on your next patrol." He assured me that success lay ahead of us, that the newest type U-boats were expected any day, and that conventional boats used in training flotillas were now pouring into port in greater numbers. Our conversation dragged on. We kept talking shop, never touching on the war at home. I had been awake for 5 consecutive days, and without rest for 7 weeks, and I felt an insuperable desire to go to sleep. When I noticed that the drinks had begun to affect my men, I rose abruptly, ending the party. The following morning I delivered U-953 into the shipyard for a thorough inspection. Her damages proved to be more severe than we had thought. Since she required a dry dock for these extensive repairs, it was decided to transfer her to our base in Trondheim. Armed with the report, which provided new reasons for ridding ourselves of the chief, I gathered up my logbook and charts and went to see Senior Officer West. I was greeted by a nervous man in meticulous blues. Worry had replaced the ruthlessness he displaced back in May 1944, before the Allies had struck. Without mincing words, I asked him to replace my chief. "We don't have an engineer with the qualifications you wish," he declared. "They are in limited supply. I suggest that you train Selder in the fjord before you leave for your next patrol." "Sir, I have been patient and have tried many times to teach him to handle the boat. He just doesn't have the aptitude. It was my chief warrant officer who did the chief's job. Selde would never have brought us back into port." Grudgingly, the senior said that he would look into the situation. I left his office with the feeling that the matter was not yet settled. The showdown came the next day while I was preparing boat and crew for the transfer to Trondheim. Around dusk, I was summoned by the senior. "Your chief has seen me," the senior began. "He complained that you confined him to the wardroom for most of the patrol. Why did you have to take this drastic measure, and why didn't you tell me about it?" "Sir, it was necessary for the boat's safety. I did not mention it because I thought it irrelevant." "Quite the contrary. The matter is serious enough. It changes the entire concept. I now understand your situation. I certainly do not approve of your action. Is that clear?" "I beg to remind you, sir, that the captain's responsibility begins with the safety of ship and crew. If that is jeopardized, he has standing authorization to take any measures he sees fit. The captain is the sole judge of a situation and of the steps needed to meet it. As captain, I did what I judged was necessary to save boat and crew. I grant you all that, but you should not have resorted to such a solution. I see the matter clearly now. Your chief will be removed." Despite the urgency of my departure for Trondheim, the senior engaged me in a lengthy conversation. He said that close to 60 old-type U-boats were in process of being fitted out for the front. More important, 80 large and 40 small-type submersibles of the newest design were nearing the end of their training and would be ready presently, in 2 weeks at most, to strike in an unprecedented offensive. Soon we would have more than 150 U-boats sailing around the British Isles, cutting off the Allies' supplies for their continental front. I listened to the news with fascination and excitement. Yet it all seemed too simple. According to Rosing, Germany would be resurrected in just a matter of weeks. I wondered whether he had heard the latest armed forces communiques. The same evening, April 11th, I sailed U-953 out of Bergen harbour. Aboard was a pilot, a lieutenant from the Coast Guard, who was familiar with the tricky waterways inside the fjords. The boat hammered northward through the dark waters, defying the British torpedo boats and submarines which had infiltrated the fjords and had sunk several of our ships. For 3 nights we snaked through narrow channels in inky darkness. We slid past cliffs by the margin of a hair, escaped death at Hellesøy, where U-486 had been torpedoed the night before, ran aground near Arlesund, but slipped off the rocks in the rising tide with diesels screaming in reverse, roared around lofty mountains out to sea, challenged radar impulses for an eternity, then swung into a hole in the mountains which turned out to be another fjord, barely missed ramming the cliffs at Smula, where the Norwegians had changed the beacon light to trap us, and finally arrived at the end of the 3rd night in Trondheim, where I moored the boat in the concrete bunker. It was 600 on April 14th. Since it was too early to arrange with the 13th U-boat flotilla to quarter the crew and dry dock the boat, I settled for the morning coffee. We tuned in a German radio station and soft music travelled through the compartments. I was sipping my first cup in my tiny nook when the announcer interrupted. "Stand by for a special bulletin. We will bring you important news." As the music resumed, my tiredness vanished, for a special bulletin always meant good news. What the good news could be was beyond my imagination. Just the previous night we had heard that our Ruhr industrial region was surrounded by the Allies, that the British were on their way to Hamburg, that the Americans had occupied Darmstadt, Frankfurt and Stuttgart, that the Black Forest was being swept by the French, that the Russians had occupied Vienna and were storming Berlin. And if a miracle could save Germany from downfall now, it would have to be a gigantic miracle. Now the music cut off and the voice came on again. This is a special bulletin. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the President of the United States, died on April the 12th. Providence has removed one of the fiercest enemies of our country. Providence is with the German people. Roosevelt's death is of far-reaching significance. The unity of the Allies will soon break down and the war will turn in our favour. I repeat, Franklin Delano Roosevelt has died in the United States. The announcer's voice was drowned in the brassy chords of a military march. My men, who had listened silently, continued their breakfast. Quite obviously, the news did not seem important enough to them to divert their attention from their boat, their homes, their families. As for myself, I could see nothing in Roosevelt's death that offered Germany any encouragement. Someone else would step into his place and continue the same remorseless course. The compound of the flotilla, though at one time an important base of the U-boat war in the Arctic, was small, and I did not meet anyone I knew. I reported our arrival and had the crew accommodated in the barracks. The move from boat to quarters was easily accomplished. A toothbrush, some underwear, U-boat fatigues. These were all that we had to call our own. To keep myself informed, I took the shortwave radio from the boat into my room. The war news sent my thoughts wandering back to the places where I had spent my youth, to Frankfurt and the Black Forest, where German people and German soil were already under Allied rule. Now the rest of Germany was being crushed between two giant forces, and the fighting was so desperate that young and old, women as well as men, were told to make a last stand to fight with tooth and fingernail and a Panzerfaust against the mighty invaders.